talk a little bit about some of the major influences on Mary Shelley's composition of Frankenstein, different genres of literature, and also the contemporary science that she was familiar with that inspired her. The first influence you'll notice, though not the most important, is the epistolary novel. That's a novel in which the story is told entirely in letters between the characters. It was a popular form in the 18th century. You can find good examples in Samuel Richardson's Clarissa and Pamela. He was the instigator of the epistolary novel. Goethe's very famous romantic novel, The Sorrows of Young Bertha, and Jane Austen's unpublished novel, Lady Susan. Her first draft of Pride and Prejudice, which was called First Impressions, was also epistolary, but we don't have that text anymore. The frame narrative of Frankenstein is epistolary. So what you get are the letters of Walton to his sister. Now, a frame narrative is a story that frames the main story. Usually comes at the beginning and at the end of the main story. So in Frankenstein, Walton's Arctic expedition serves as the frame narrative. The second influence is much more significant, and that's the Gothic novel. Oftentimes, Frankenstein is identified as a Gothic novel, and it does share many characteristics with the Gothic. But to avoid confusion, I want to go back and think about the origins of the term Gothic, because it's actually very strange that this form of literature is called Gothic. So, Gothic was originally a term of insult. The words Goth and Gothic were just descriptive words to describe the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, which sacked Rome and ravaged the rest of Europe in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Goths were barbarians, so if somebody called you Gothic, that was an insult. The Renaissance art historian Giorgio Vasari used the term to describe what he called the barbarous German style of medieval architecture. So again, Gothic was being used as an insult, but this time to describe a form of architecture. So Gothic architecture was dominant in the 12th through the 16th centuries. It used pointed arches, which you can see in this picture of a cathedral here, vaults, flying buttresses, narrow spires, stained glass windows, intricate traceries, and varied details, lots and lots of details. Its upward movement was meant to suggest heavenward aspirations. It was used for cathedrals and churches, of course, but also for abbeys and castles. The Enlightenment in the early 18th century preferred neoclassical architecture. You see the White House here. It's neoclassical with its rationality and simplicity and symmetry. But the Romantics loved the more barbarous, the more folksy medieval Gothic. Now, you are very familiar with some neoclassical and Gothic buildings if you've been on the Mizzou campus. Jesse Hall, clearly neoclassical. Memorial Union, Gothic. The application of Gothic to literature comes in the 18th century with Horace Walpole. Walpole wrote what is considered the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, which was published in 1764. And he was inspired to write it by his reconstruction of his home in the Gothic style and by a nightmare that he had had. Essentially, the literature was called Gothic literature because it was often set in spooky Gothic buildings. So the name Gothic architecture, it got transferred to the literature that was set in that kind of architecture. So you get ruined abbeys, medieval castles with secret passageways. And from this original Gothic novel sprang a whole genre of novels that shared some key characteristics. Murder, death, suicide, right? Very dramatic novels. Ghosts, demons, gloomy settings, family secrets, dungeons, curses, torture, vampires, spirits, definitely castles, tombs, and terror. This was an early form of horror novel, or maybe better, suspense novel, since in many of the Gothic novels, it's not exactly what happened, but what you think is going to happen that creates the terror. Okay, there are a few more Gothic conventions that I wanted to mention. The damsel in distress, she frequently faints in horror. Secret corridors, passageways or rooms, ancestral curses, ruined castles with graveyards nearby, priests and monks, a lot of them were strongly anti-Catholic, sleep, dream, death-like states, and doubles or doppelgangers. That's characters who parallel each other, that seem to be part of the same psyche. The Gothic hero becomes a kind of archetype, as we find there's a pattern to his characterization. The protagonist is usually isolated. That's important, voluntarily or involuntarily. There's the villain, and no shades of gray here, the epitome of evil, either by his own fall from grace or by some implicit malevolence, the epitome of evil. There's also the wanderer. You find him in many Gothic tales, who represents the epitome of isolation as he wanders the earth in perpetual exile, usually a form of divine punishment. And I think you can see the figure of the wanderer in the Ancient Mariner. Frankenstein differs in many ways from the typical Gothic novel, but there are some interesting similarities that you can trace as you continue to read. Another way to think about Frankenstein, though, is as a work of science fiction. But its original readers couldn't think about it that way because science fiction hadn't yet been invented. The next important science fiction will be the work of Jules Verne in the late 19th century. But Frankenstein could be considered the first science fiction novel. Like many science fiction writers, Mary Shelley bases her work in contemporary science. She speculates about advances in science and what would happen if science continued to move in the same direction. And she critiques contemporary society. Now, the contemporary science that Shelley and Byron had been discussing on those dreary days in the Villa Diodati included the work of Luigi, Galvani, and Giovanni Aldini. Both, you might be surprised to hear, Italian. Luigi Galvani lived from 1737 to 1798, and he was an Italian scientist. He discovered what he called animal electricity and was later called galvanism. He did experiments on frogs, and these experiments seemed to show that you could take a dead frog and make it jump, give it the appearance of life by the application of electricity. And so the question that Shelley and Byron were discussing would be something like this. Is electricity that vital force? Is it the secret of life, the thing that separates the living from the dead? And if so, is there any way of bringing back the dead? Here are some drawings, some diagrams of his work on frogs. You can see the frog here attached at 2 points to a battery. Here's a drawing showing a large set of experiments, again attaching frog legs and frog parts to batteries. And more interesting, I think, in the context of Frankenstein, here he experiments with lightning as the source of electricity, attaching the frog, which you see on the table there, to a lightning rod. Mary Shelley is very careful never to specify how Victor brings his creature to life, but she implies at several points that it has to do with electricity. Giovanni Aldini was a little later. He was a nephew of Galvani, who lived from 1762 to 1834. He popularized Galvani's work and extended his uncle's ideas about Galvanism. And this is important. He traveled throughout Europe, including to England, doing demonstrations of Galvanism, including Galvanism on a human corpse. Here is a picture of this kind of experiment, and here's an account of this experiment by Professor Farah, who witnessed the demonstration. On a cold morning in January 1803, George Forster, a convicted murderer, was hanged at Newgate. That's in London. After an hour, his body was taken down from the gallows and handed over to a visiting physics professor, who staged an imposing demonstration. Watched by fascinated surgeons, the professor linked the prostrate corpse to a through battery with metal plates and wires. First he worked on Forster's face. When the current started to flow, the dead jaws quivered and one eye leered open. As the experiment proceeded, Forster's clenched fist rose into the air. Then his legs started to kick back violently and his back arched. Some bystanders thought that Forster was being restored to life. So Shelley and Byron were both interested in these scientific discoveries and in what their implications were for human life. And Shelley's young wife, Mary, listened attentively to their discussions. So this is the science behind the first science fiction novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.